And if you use various indicators for the quality of democracy, you do find there is indeed a difference between democratic and autocratic countries that we can show quite nicely in these cluster diagrams. So, but let's zoom in into a little bit more detail. No, only have 40 minutes to go. Let me ask a question here. I've already talked quite a lot about citizenship regimes. I can show you more data. I can either show you more data on citizenship regimes, or I can talk briefly about multiple citizenship and then switch to voting rights. Would you like to go into more depth with regard to citizenship, birth, by naturalization, or would you prefer that I also talk about dual citizenship and voting rights? Who, let's do a show of hands. Who is in favor of?
And we have also talked about
yes, indeed. I will cover that in any case. Okay. So who wants more data on citizenship laws? Right, and who wants more, also some time and reflections on electoral rights? 1, 2, 3. I've counted 2 against 3. Is that right? So majority wins. So I'll skip some of this, but it's included in a German language handout that I've sent you, so you can easily access this. Actually only a few slides that I skip here. This is already about dual citizenship. So, first thing to know about multiple citizenship is that it can emerge both at birth and through naturalization. And there are different norms applying to this. When it emerges through birth, most European states now accept unconditionally multiple nationality. How does it emerge at birth? How can you become a dual citizen by birth? Quick replies, please. How can you get 2 passports as a child at birth? Yeah.
One for your parents, and one by the state you're getting born.
Indeed, that's one way. So let's assume both your parents have the same nationality, a foreign nationality, and but you're born in a country that has you solely. Then you get the foreign nationality from your parents and the nationality of the country because of birth in the territory. This happens all the time, for example, in the US, in the Americas. What's the other way how you can get? Exactly, if you're mixed nationality parents, right? So, and even if one parent already has dual nationality, they can very often pass on both of these to the child. There is a nice chart. Look for the next issue of National Geographic, where my co-author and colleague Martin Fink did a nice infographic, 9 different ways how you can get citizenship. And the National Geographic people actually said, oh, let's call it how you can get 9 passports at the same time. Theoretically, it's possible, right? But it's rarely the case. But these are independent ways to multiple nationality, 9 different ways how you can acquire it. Right? And the basic ones through birth we've just covered. The other way how you can get it is through naturalization. But then there are here again 2 ways how you can get it. You can get it either through the country of origin tolerating that when you are abroad you will acquire a new nationality, or the country of immigration tolerating that when you get the nationality of that country you don't have to renounce your citizenship of origin. Actually, in order to get it, both these rules must apply. Right? So you can, if one country says, well, we allow you to keep your nationality of origin, but the country of immigration says, we don't allow you to retain it, right? Then you can only naturalize if you give it up. But countries do this completely independently from each other. So we have to look at what do countries do with regard to their diasporas, their immigrants, and what do countries do with regard to their immigrants. Do they impose a condition that bans dual citizenship? And here's the slide for the diasporas, again done by Martin Fink. This is a longitudinal database, which is great. You know, most of our data are still for the last couple of years since 2013. And this goes back to 1960. And what you see there is a very strong global trend. So the dark line is the world. And here you see the different continents. And you see dual citizenship toleration for expats is rising and rising. The strongest rise is among the Americas, especially South American countries. Now 91% don't have a problem if their expats acquire another citizenship abroad. Why? Because these are strong emigration countries, and they want to keep ties with their diasporas. They want to get their remittances, but they also don't want to lose them in terms of a politically connected force, cultural ambassadors, whatever. More and more reasons why countries don't want to lose their diasporas just because they get another citizenship. Now, yeah, sure.
Recently, in the news here in Austria, was all these Turkish cases where, for all intents and purposes, they had become Austrian citizens out of you, and then the next time they went back to Turkey on vacation or whatever, and the citizen in Holland themselves allowed a Turkish passport, which apparently is illegal in Austria.
It is, yes.
There's no way around it, or I mean, how do you now criminalize?
Well, it's not part of criminal law, but the Austrian situation is as follows. As a condition for naturalization, you must renounce your citizenship of origin to prove within 2 years that you have actually lost it. But since Turkey changed its law in the 1990s and allowed their expats to retain Turkish nationality when they acquire a foreign one, the situation was so that Turks in Austria, same thing in Germany, by the way, gave up their Turkish nationality. They actually did renounce it and could prove that, acquired Austrian or German nationality, and then were re-invited by Turkish consulates. They didn't even have to go back to Turkey to reacquire Turkish nationality. And most were not aware that this was not possible under Austrian law, because under Austrian law, you lose Austrian nationality ex lege as soon as you will acquire a foreign nationality, right? Without having permission to retain Austrian nationality. So if the Austrian authorities have firm proof that these people have reacquired Turkish nationality, then from that point onwards, they are no longer Austrian nationals. There is not even room for discretion. Until now. Let's see what happens now, because there is a new verdict by the European Court of Justice, the Tepes case, that says the rule of proportionality applies, and you must also look into the individual cases. So citizenship deprivation ex lege is problematic. The Tepes case applies this to cases where people would lose their EU citizenship, so it, which is also the case here. If Turks lose their Austrian citizenship, they lose their EU citizenship as well. So it's an interesting question whether that judgment will force the Austrian legislature eventually to change its law and to make citizenship deprivation in such a case not a matter of ex lege loss, but of a withdrawal decision that needs to be taken by authorities, that needs to take the individual case into account under proportionality principle. But this is an ongoing matter of dispute. Yeah.
What about the Austrian position that actually persons of interest, like some of the personas,
well,
go to them and go after them?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there are several provisions in Austrian law where dual citizenship is accepted. I already mentioned when it's acquired at birth, no problem. When it's acquired through naturalization based on special achievements or in the interest of the Republic. When it's acquired now also because you are a Holocaust victim or a descendant of a Holocaust victim, then you can keep your other citizenship, Israeli or American in most cases. So there are a number of exceptions when Austria accepts dual citizenship, also in case of naturalization, but not in the standard case for the ordinary immigrants. There it's still prohibited and taboo. And the interesting thing is, in Austria, it goes both ways. So I've called this outgoing naturalization and incoming naturalization. So the immigrants that acquire Austrian citizenship and the Austrians who acquire foreign citizenship, right? Outgoing naturalization. And if you look at, this is now for our global sample of 175 countries, where we've just looked at, is there a condition for renouncing your citizenship of origin as a condition in incoming naturalization? Is there a loss of your citizenship of origin as a consequence of acquiring a foreign one in outgoing naturalizations? And what you find is, it's only 18% in the sample of countries that do not allow dual citizenship in either case, right? So both for the expats and for the immigrants. And Austria is in that group. And in Europe, it's very few other countries left in that group. The Netherlands is still there, except that the Netherlands has many more exceptions for the incoming naturalizations. It accepts dual citizenship in about 50% of all cases, and Austria doesn't. Germany is also in that group, but again, has many more exceptions than Austria has. And on the other hand, you see 47% that accept dual citizenship in all cases, at birth, in incoming naturalizations, and in outgoing naturalizations. So have a general toleration of dual citizenship. So this is now the strongest group of countries that we find, which clearly shows that the idea that dual citizenship is an irregularity that somehow need to be constrained by international legal norms is a thing of the past. This is no longer true on a global scale. It is only still true for individual countries. And here we have done in collaboration with the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, a series of infographics that shows you now this result broken down by world region. So first you have Europe, which is the most checkered continent in a way, where you have countries that still don't allow the red ones, dual citizenship neither for immigrants nor immigrants. By the way, this has already changed. These are data for 2016. Norway has dropped out of that group. It's now generally accepting dual citizenship in both cases. And there are cases like Spain that look red here, but if you look closer, actually they tolerate it de facto because there is no way they check on the renunciation of a previous citizenship. So that's what Europe looks like. This is the Americas, strikingly different, general toleration of dual citizenship. And the only countries that are exceptional here are Chile, Mexico, and Central American states that don't accept it for immigrants, but do accept it for immigrants. Right? Africa, surprisingly also for us, the majority of countries accept dual citizenship in both cases, outgoing and incoming, but there are a few outliers that restrict it either for the immigrants or for the immigrants, and a few red countries that restrict it for both. And here is the story of Asia and why it's still different. China, India, Pakistan, the other countries, and Japan and South Korea, they are countries that still stick to this old paradigm that state sovereignty means you cannot have two citizenships, right? It's the idea that you can't be the servant of two masters, right? That will create conflicts between your duties and an unjust accumulation of rights. So they still think dual citizenship ought to be prohibited. In the case of India, that has to do with the history of partition with Pakistan, right? They want to avoid that Pakistanis could ever reclaim Indian citizenship, right? And therefore prohibited even for overseas Indians. And they created a special status of overseas citizenship of India, which is not Indian nationality, just in order to link with their diasporas. They have an urgent need of money from the diaspora, right? But they can't allow them dual nationality because they're terribly afraid that their Supreme Court or Constitutional Court, I think it's called, would then say, well, that needs to apply consistently also to people in Bangladesh or in Pakistan. And China has this general idea, you know, your loyalty to China has to be unique, right? You can't have any duties towards another country if you're a Chinese national. and this is Oceania. Right. Australia, again, there's an interesting story. Australia allows dual citizenship, but recently, you might have seen in the news, there were a number of cases of members of parliament who lost their mandate because they were found out to be dual nationals. In most cases, dual nationals by birth who had not been even aware that they had another citizenship. They didn't have the passports, they just had the right to claim them. There is a constitutional provision in Australia that prohibits multiple citizens to be members, even to run for candidates in parliamentary elections. Right? And the Constitutional Court enforced this by depriving these parliamentarians of their mandates. Very interesting, you know, whether the norm of dual citizenship applies differently to voting and to candidacy. So combining now the two topics, is there a case to be made that if you are a member of parliament, you have a special responsibility towards your constituency, right? Therefore, you cannot have another loyalty towards another country. I think there's some way how to make this plausible, but I think it would have been enough to tell them, the parliamentarians, you cannot use actively your second citizenship while you have office, but it would not be necessary to deprive them of their second citizenship for the rest of their lives, because their period in office, you know, it's only a couple of years. So there could be a way how to make the second citizenship dormant, which is actually what is the rule between Latin America and Spain, where they have dual citizenship treaties, where they agree that it's no problem to have two citizenships, but you can only have one active citizenship at one point in time. The other one will remain dormant. Okay, so 10 minutes to go. That means, should I still start to talk about? Yes, do we take the additional period? So I'll talk very briefly about electoral rights and maybe just show you this basic conceptual idea. So as I explained already in the morning, you know, let's distinguish between the citizenry, all people who have nationality, and the demos, all people who have voting rights. Right? And let's assume as a starting point a scenario where there is no migration. So what would you then have is you would have the demos would be identical with the citizenry, maybe with the exception of people underage and other forms of exclusion from the voting rights. But the residents and the citizens would be identical categories, more or less. That's one ideal type. They would also be the voters. Now, what happens when we introduce migration? In that scenario is migration brings in residents who are not citizens, right? This is the gray slide here. And it takes out citizens who are no longer residents, right? The immigrants. The question is, how do democracies then adapt to that change in terms of their allocation of voting rights? And one way they might react to this is by what I would call insulating the demos from migration. That means you ignore migration. You just pretend it doesn't happen. You say, the immigrants can't vote, the immigrants can't vote, it's only the resident citizens who can vote. The other possibility is to expand the demos across the border by saying, well, voting rights is a privilege of citizens and citizens only. So therefore, those who have left the country can still vote. Those who have come into the country cannot vote until or unless they have become citizens. Democratic theorists have very often advocated the opposite stance. They have said all those whose interests, now some democratic theorists say that voting rights belong to all those whose interests are affected by the decisions of a legislator. So if you take that principle, quod omnis tanget, ab omnibus approbetur in Latin, right? It's an old Roman law principle. If you think this is the right principle for determining who is the right to vote, then you would probably end up with something like this. You would say, well, the immigrants clearly are affected But also the immigrants are affected because they are still citizens, they might want to return, you know, they link up with the country, their interests are affected. Therefore, a general inclusive franchise. A second group of theorists says, no, that's the wrong principle. We need to include only those who are subjected to the law and to coercion, right? And if you do this, it's much more likely that you will defend the right of the immigrants to vote, but a loss of voting rights for the immigrants because they are no longer subject to most of the laws, even if their interests are affected in some broad way. And then, you know, what we find empirically is, as I already suggested also in this morning, interesting enough, none of these scenarios. No. What we find instead is a level-specific expansion of the franchise. We find a strong expansion of the franchise to the immigrants, to the diaspora at the national level, and a less strong, but also for a significant group of countries, an expansion of the franchise for the non-citizen residents at the local level. So you find two different conceptions of the demos. A demos that is based on nationality at the national level, and a demos that is based on residence at the local level. And I think that is one thing I'd like to make sense of in terms of democratic theory, and the debate on urban citizenship that I've mentioned before is about that topic in a way. Is the case for disconnecting citizenship at the national level and at the local level, and it's exemplified by these different distribution of voting rights. And then we can see this also in empirical results. So if you look at the non-citizen franchise in Europe and the Americas, we've only covered these two world regions. You see that North America and Central America doesn't have it, interesting enough. You know, these are countries that mostly have quite often regimes for immigrant naturalization, but they don't grant immigrants voting rights before naturalization. Right? Only very few countries, I think 1 or 2 municipalities in Delaware do it, and some cities have campaigned in the US, also New York, for granting immigrants voting rights independently of their citizenship, but they